in the first place. Resources are even the reason that the moon races came down to the Earth to begin with, and I wonder if the government took over Earth for a very similar reason. We also know that they hold these native cleansings every 3 years, and I'm wondering if all these manhunts have just been some strategic play at getting some important resources, because we know that Vegapunk has said money and resources are the main things holding him back from making more and more advancements, and God Valley is kind of our example of how the government gets those things in the first place, on top of the celestial tribute that they take from all their allied nations, of course. Maybe they're doing all of this just to ensure that nobody gets the resources possible to become advanced like the ancient kingdom. If anyone is going to do it in the modern day, they're making sure that those people would be under their thumb. And now maybe another reason that they hold these kind of cleansings is because those races posed a threat to them, like the Lunarians or Buccaneers, which we know are extremely hard to find. So I bet that the Great Cleansing is just a grander version of this thing from God Valley. But I think a key reason why the government tries to eliminate practically everyone and sort of 100% the game is because of what we learned from Dr. Hiriuluk. You aren't truly dead until you're forgotten. Your will can be inherited by people who live on in the future. So the way around that, if you're an evil mastermind at least, is to try and just clean house. If you get rid of every single person who is against your cause, then you can create any narrative you want because nobody is around who knows any better. It's just like Doflamingo was saying after Marineford. Justice will prevail, you say? But of course it will. Whoever wins this war becomes justice. We even saw in Dressrosa that Sugar could sort of take this to the next level by using her devil fruit powers. By turning people into toys, everyone who knew them forgot they even existed. People lived on blissfully unaware of the tragedies surrounding them. And when people did become aware later on, thanks to Usopp knocking out Sugar, Doflamingo tried to take out every last person on the island using the birdcage. He did this to sorta kinda do a reset. And that's where we are right now in the final saga. Vegapunk revealing the truth is equivalent to Sugar passing out, meaning the world is now becoming privy to specific information. So the flood is now Emu's version of the birdcage, more or less. And this is exactly why the poneglyphs are so important. These indestructible stones act as a permanent message to the world about the truth. A truth that can share the will of those from 800 years ago, even if they aren't around to share it themselves. And it seems like what they left behind were the pieces of a plan to kind of survive the next flood in the future. Some might guide you to Laugh Tale, which gives you both the One Piece and all the truths of the world. Some guide you to the ancient weapons, which might be needed to survive the flood, and then some just explain the true history. All of these things can kind of help us be ready for the next time this flood happens. This is why races like the Shandorians fought so hard to protect these stones, because we know for sure that they had a direct conflict with the 20 Kings back in the day. Robin discovered this during Skypiea, which makes their history from the moon all the more interesting. Even if they didn't know what the message actually said on the poneglyph, they knew that protecting it was still of the utmost importance. And they were right, because we now know that poneglyph holds the location of the ancient weapon Poseidon. Had they lost control of that poneglyph at any point, whether back in the Void Century or even after Noland alerted Marijois of the existence of the City of Gold, then perhaps neither Roger nor Luffy would have ever found out Poseidon was down in Fishman Island. This would have then ruined the opportunity to align the ancient weapon with the good guys, which might be essential for saving those from a flood in modern times thanks to the Ark Noah. I mean, if there's a global flood, then the one group you want on your side for sure is the Fishmen, right? This is why Luffy mending the relationship between the Fishmen and the humans has been so vital. Now when the flood happens, the Fishmen may have more of a reason to help the humans out by using the Noah. It might be like the ultimate evacuation ship of sorts, which we've seen a number of times throughout the story actually, namely in Ohara, Hachinosu, and Egghead. In Ohara, that evacuation ship was destroyed by Akainu. In Hachinosu, it was protected by Kobe, who destroyed Pizarro's arm. And then in Egghead, it was protected by the Giants. Oda loves this sort of helpless evacuation ship trope, and I can see the Noah eventually being the biggest version of that, almost housing the young and the weak from many different countries, which would then of course make it a major target for Emu and then make Poseidon's job all the more important. And I think this may also be related to why the ancient robot attacked Marijois 200 years ago, because back then the Fishmen were set to join the reverie, but it was obviously well before Luffy, aka Joy Boy, was around. If the Fishmen, or Poseidon specifically, became an ally to the the world government 200 years ago, and still was today, then we also may not have her on our side. The Fishmen may have moved to the surface a long time ago, and who knows where they would be now. I mean, even when Shirahoshi went to the most recent reverie, she was almost captured twice by Sharlos, where she was only freed thanks to Sai, Leo, and probably most importantly, Mjosgard, who was actually being put to death by Garling for doing so. I almost wonder if Garling knows how important Shirahoshi or the Fishmen truly are, and so Mjosgard's punishment is kind of related to that. So it seems to me like the Iron Giant basically just went up there to scare everyone, at least enough so they would keep the Fishmen away. Because since it's their first time being at a reverie in a long time, and then this giant robot shows up, they would kind of blame it on them, I guess. And this way, the Fishmen wouldn't get to rejoin for 50 more reveries. And this might all explain why Joy Boy had to leave behind an apology. It was probably better for the Fishmen to stay at the bottom of the sea until he could return and guide them. He probably had them stay at Fishman Island on purpose. They may not understand why, and obviously this led to some suffering along the way for them, to put it lightly, but ultimately it may have been the only way to save the world. Thus why he made an entire poneglyph just to apologize. So it seems to me like the Ancient Kingdom had a very, very specific plan in place to make sure we had what we needed to help the world survive the flood today. And that doesn't just end at Poseidon. Let's talk more about Pluton. It's currently held underneath one of the most impenetrable islands in One Piece, which is Wano. I would even say it's flood-proof because of its walls, except for the fact that the walls actually made it flood with fresh water instead, which is some beautiful irony, I think. But the walls still had a purpose, which seems to be able to hold Pluton there and protect it. And even Momo refused to break the walls yet, which kept Pluton locked up just a little bit longer. This ship probably has a major role going forward in helping with the flood, just as Poseidon does. And if you're familiar with my main Pluton theory, then you probably know that I don't think this ship is just going to be a conventional one either. Because I think Pluton is going to be a mole, or at the very, very minimum, a ship that can dig. It's already underground as it is, it's named after the god of the underworld, and we know that it's possible to dig under the sea already because of the boss of the earth, which is a giant mole that Gadatsu met in his cover story with Mount Fuji on his helmet, which we know is in Wano. This mole even left behind a literal tunnel which helps people travel from Alabasta over to Okari Island, where they visit the hot springs. If the world were to ever flood, and there were tsunamis and storms everywhere, then traveling under the sea would be one of the safest options. I mean, imagine having a giant tunnel network just for people to travel in and avoid the ocean entirely. Or something even crazier, what if most islands coat themselves in bubbles before the flood even happens, just like Fishman Island? If so, then digging island to island would be one of the best ways to travel around, since you don't even have to deal with the sea. Now, you could do the same kind of thing with a coated ship, but I mean, tunnels would be a lot safer and faster. And then for Uranus, it seems to me like the most likely place to find this weapon is Elbaf, potentially waiting for us at the top of the Atom Tree. I'll leave a link below to a few videos I've done that talk about this more in depth, but if this was true, then Elbaf would be a pretty safe place for the Ancient Kingdom to leave this weapon, because the Giants are one of the strongest races in the entire One Piece world, unless they're fighting Mr. 3. And the Elbaf Giants are also constantly at war, so subjugating them and trying to take the ancient weapon off their hands would be pretty difficult. So between these three weapons, I think it's clear that the Ancient Kingdom left each of them in certain places, for certain reasons, and probably for certain people to get a hold of so that they could help the world survive a flood. But what I find really interesting is that the ancient weapons also tie to the names of 3 different planets, and the Gorosei are named after the 5 other planets. Between the 2 groups, they make up the 8 other planets of our solar system aside from Earth, if you're counting Pluto, which I definitely am. I love Pluto. And this is where we have to talk about the Ancient Kingdom symbol, which has one big circle in the middle with 8 smaller circles around the outside. We've seen this thing in quite a few places now, like most recently in Kuma's church, where he likely preached about Nika, or in Skypiea on Wiper's arm, or the shields near Usopp's rubber band land, or on the Kozuki crest, and maybe even the symbol of Alabasta. All these places have had extremely close ties to Joy Boy or the Ancient Kingdom, and this symbol could very well be representing the Earth with 8 planets surrounding it, maybe hinting that the Ancient Kingdom once made it to space, which I would almost argue we can already confirm because, again, we know the sky races are from the moon and they were allied with the Ancient Kingdom. But maybe most importantly, I also noticed this symbol hidden in the most recent opening of the One Piece anime, because of the angle they showed these things floating around Punk Records. These things kind kind of remind me of like moons orbiting a planet, or planets orbiting a sun. So I have to wonder what these things really are and what this could all mean. I saw a great video recently from King of Lightning about what these things are, and I highly recommend checking it out. But to me, this is at least Oda giving us like a 3D version of the Ancient Kingdom symbol, because almost everything Vegapunk has done already is somewhat of a parallel to the Ancient Kingdom as it is, because he's so highly advanced, and this is yet probably another example of that. But we know that the Ancient Kingdom's technology is always even one step ahead of Vegapunk, right? As I mentioned with the Devil Fruits. So I think this is yet another sign that the Ancient Kingdom was operating in space, and probably built bases on these different planets, or honestly, may have even built the planets outright, creating one major interplanetary alliance. And I think this could all even be hinted in Ohara's geocentric planetary model, which stands out immediately to me because most of the time you're gonna have a heliocentric system instead, which revolves around the sun. But instead, we have the Earth at the center, and the other planets around it are quite a bit smaller as you would expect, which is basically what we also see over on their symbol. But now the question is, are all of those planets still out there now? Because we haven't really seen anything in space other than the one sun or moon so far in the story, unless you count Enies Lobby sun, but whatever. Even in the Enel cover story, you don't see any other planets in the background. So this isn't necessarily proof, but it at least still provides the question of if those planets are still out there somewhere. And my guess is that they aren't, and that they were actually used to create the Red Line. I think that during the Void Century, the 20 Kings probably pulled these planets down to build up the Red Line into what it is today. And that's why it has varying climates just as you would find across the Grand Line. It's from all the different parts of planets or moons or whatever they're really called that were pulled down to Earth. I mean, the government subjugated the entire Earth over the last 800 years, so it shouldn't be that surprising that they would just straight up take other planets if they wanted to. Now, it is important to note that the Red Line did exist before the Void Century, and we know this because of a discussion Marco had with Whitebeard, where it was said that it was God's land up there, which was actually referring to the Lunarians. But that doesn't mean that the Red Line today has to be the same exact shape or size that it used to be. And I did do a video a while ago about one option for this that I'll leave down in the description, but I think the main takeaway in general here is that the government probably used those planets to like complete the Red Line, to make it so it went all the way around the world and acted as a dam basically, minus the hole at Fishman Island of course. And we can kind of assume that they used it in this way because of Laboon, who bangs his head on the Red Line as if it isn't supposed to be there or something. This could be due to some kind of instincts for the island whales regarding migration patterns or whatever, or at the very minimum it could just be a thematic symbol from Oda that the Red Line should not be there. This has fueled a lot of theories about whether we may destroy the Red Line one day, kind of resetting the world into what it's supposed to be. Maybe this will also fix the calm belts or a lot of the other wacky weather patterns we've seen before in One Piece that make the world so hard to traverse. Or in other words, what make it so hard to just be a pirate, which is something that I want to hone in on a bit more because fixing the weather has been a major focus for Vegapunk ever since the very beginning of his time as a scientist, even going back to his birthplace in Karakuri Island. He never managed to solve the issue while he lived there, but he eventually did after his studies on Egghead. He can change the climate and even detect all living beings on the island using the aircon system, which is something that Enel and the Gorosei could also do, which I find pretty interesting. But as with most of these technological advancements, I would have to venture a guess that the Ancient Kingdom did the same thing as Vegapunk, but better. And I bet that their version of the aircon was the ancient weapon Uranus. The god of the sky controlling the weather just kind of makes sense. And this takes us right back to what I was saying earlier about the importance of resources, because Atlas even said that with more resources and competent engineers, they could control the weather completely. When Lilith was talking about Egghead's power source, Frankie even questioned how many natural resources that takes. Vegapunk straight up said that wars are fought over this stuff. That's why the battle for Earth was so important. As we saw with the 3 sky races on the moon, Earth was the place that had the resources necessary to sustain life. This is probably why the Skypians worship Verth so much as well. It seems to me that the Ancient Kingdom made an attempt to share the planet's resources with as many people as possible, even with people living on planets beyond the Earth. Vegapunk even mentioned that this kingdom was bountiful when speaking of Joy Boy's birth. This was probably a place that everyone had what they needed, which is a good contrast to the islands ran by the 20 kings, or at least in particular the Don Quixote, who we know the most about from before the Void Century started, because thanks to the Tintata history books, we know the Don Quixote family were absolutely loaded around this time period. They used the Tintata as slaves, and all of their citizens became rich because of it. Some had more than they needed, while some, like the Tintata, had nothing at all. This tells us two things that are really important about the Void Century. One being that the 20 kings had money and resources to blow, which, as we've covered, are essential to getting weapons and military power. And two, their citizens were probably very, very supportive of their kings. Those citizens were very well off. Why would they question or disagree with anything their kings are doing? Even if they did care about people around the world and didn't want the kings to hurt them, they'd probably just be fed some fake story that would justify the decisions the kings were making. Or as King Bakori said in Sorbet, people would get accustomed to their new status and see the others for the quote-unquote vermin that they are. This whole thing feels almost like a giant science experiment, which probably ties to the Gorosei comparing humans to insects all the time. Saturn even said, "Remember, human life holds no more value than that of an insect. No matter how far their numbers dwindle, it's always possible for them to multiply again." He probably said this because he's seen it happen firsthand. It almost seems as if they set out to reduce the numbers of most races as low as possible, and in the case of races like the Lunarians or Buccaneers, that's almost down to zero. Even here at Egghead, as Vegapunk's message starts getting revealed to the world, the Gorosei decide to just outright eradicate all life forms on the island entirely. And so when it comes to the Void Century, I think at least one of the main ways the 20 kings achieved that 900 years ago was by pooling their immense fortunes together to buy some crazy weapons, or to just pay someone to build or steal it for them. Which takes us back to what I was saying at the very beginning of the video, about the Anti-Pluton and its connection to the Mother Flame. Because that kind of idea is exactly what happened with the hole at Lelucia, right? The government gave Vegapunk, or York I guess in this case, whatever they needed to build all this stuff, like the Seraphim, the Pacifista, or even the Mother Flame. There probably aren't many groups in the world, if any at all, that would have the money or resources necessary to help him accomplish that. So then whenever we go look at Enies Lobby, it was probably a similar story, but even crazier, where the 20 kings were the only ones with enough money to pay someone to build it, or even just steal it, which was basically what happened during Enies Lobby, right? Not only did Cypherpole sneak into Galila to try to get the blueprints, but in Frankie's flashback, Spandam and the rest of Cypherpole stole his battleships to use on Water 7. They took them and used them for the wrong reasons. Frankie never would have used them to hurt people, but Cypherpole did. And such is the duality of dangerous weapons like that. Again, this is why York quote-unquote sending it matters so much. The government almost always needs someone on the inside to actually obtain what they want the most. So the same thing probably happened with the hole at Enies Lobby when it was first made. But even though that weapon is a counter to Pluton, the real Pluton is still around to this very day. So the government must have been aiming at something else, or they just missed maybe. But my guess is that they were attacking the ancient kingdom itself, or at least their capital, or whatever the island was that Clover saw in his mind's eye during the O'Hara flashback, because that flashback actually occurred during Enies Lobby, right? So combining the two in that way sort of makes sense, and kind of feels obvious when you think about it. And this goes back to a very important point I made earlier in the video, where Lelucia is dark and stormy, which is the opposite to Enies Lobby that is daylight 24/7. It's called Never Night Island for a reason, and the reason for this almost has to be the power source, because that is the one thing Vegapunk has yet to figure out. It's what powers the ancient robot, and likely why Vegapunk was literally inside of the thing researching it when we met him for the first time. Lilith told us that if they were able to get on that level, they would be able to make their own sun, thus explaining why Enies Lobby is always daytime. The weapon that was used there used that kind of power source, and that's probably what was included on Frankie's blueprints. But the Mother Flame doesn't use that power source because Vegapunk has yet to figure it out. Now this one is still insanely impressive, no question about it, and is the best power source we've seen in One Piece so far. I mean, it's definitely better than Cola, but the ancient kingdoms was better and capable of creating their own sun. And that's how Enies Lobby became what it is now. The 20 kings probably used that kingdom's greatest his creation against them to wipe them out. I mean, how else would you beat a highly advanced kingdom like that? You have to fight fire with fire, or in this case, sun with sun, or sun versus sun god. And I think this whole thing with Vegapunk is just exemplary of how he's always one step away from creating what the ancient kingdom created. He tried recreating Kaido's fruit, and Momo turned pink instead of blue. He tried duplicating Paramecia fruits, and he could only do it with the use of green blood. And then for Logias, he just couldn't duplicate them at all. This isn't to say that Vegapunk sucks or that his inventions aren't impressive, but he's simply not on the same level as the ancient kingdom. However, it appears that this weapon was still good enough in the eyes of Emu since they're trying to recreate it. I mean, it does wipe islands from existence and starts floods, so I mean, what else do you need? But we need to then ask an important question. Who built the Anti-Pluton back then that the government used at Enies Lobby? And my first guess would actually be the giant robot, the one who just woke up and immediately apologized to Joy Boy. What if he is apologizing because he is responsible for the weapon that created a hole at Enies Lobby? And this would go double if what's under that hole was something important for the ancient kingdom, and if it helped lead to the 20 Kings' control of the world today. This robot even uses the same power source that the ancient kingdom had, and it awoke to Luffy's drum's liberation, hinting there's a connection between the two. And his apology reminds me a little bit of Zunesha, who was said to be Joy Boy's companion, but also committed a great crime 800 years ago. And we even have Joy Boy's apology to Poseidon on the poneglyph, so everyone is sorry to one another for some reason. But I think the true identity to this robot is actually being the equivalent to Joy Boy's version of Franky, meaning he was also a companion to Joy Boy just like Zunesha was, and this makes a lot of sense because Franky's already becoming more and more of a cyborg today. And Oda showed us that in his bad timeline, where things go wrong, he becomes a legitimate robot as he gets older. And based off all the apologies and the Void Century itself, it seems to me that Joy Boy's crew was definitely in the bad timeline. So maybe this robot is basically Joy Boy's old shipwright. And I think the reason why the government maybe didn't recognize him as such when he attacked Marijois is because Franky's always altering his appearance in a major way, right? I mean, his bounty poster shows him as the Sunny now. We even saw in Karakuri that they were saying Franky turned himself into a ship, and they actually met him. They should know better. So maybe back in the day, this robot looked a lot more human-like or even cyborg-like, but over time, it became a full robot, and thus why the government didn't recognize him 200 years ago. And if you look at when that thing was introduced, it even had this pole sticking through its stomach, which reminds me a lot of when Tom got attacked by Franky's battleships in that flashback. He got hit with a harpoon and just ripped it right out of his body. Maybe we will see the robot do the same thing soon on Egghead. And we actually don't know if Tom is 100% dead yet. He's presumed dead, but we never actually saw it because he got taken away. So I wonder if he is going to come back, which Oda tends to do sometimes, but I wonder if he's going to come back as a cyborg or even a full robot, thus to parallel Franky even more, which would be crazy. But I want to hone in on the parallels in this flashback just a little bit more, because Franky didn't build those battleships for a bad reason. He was just having fun and kind of doing what he loved to do. But Cypherpole took advantage of that and framed Franky. They made him look like the bad guy just because he created them. People knew those were Franky's ships and just assumed it was his fault, even though it wasn't. The robot may have gone through the same exact thing. I mean, I doubt he would make the weapon for the 20 Kings if he knew they were evil, but maybe he made it on his own accord just because he liked building stuff, or because he seriously wanted a counter to Pluton in case that thing went haywire. Or to make this even better, maybe the 20 Kings pretended to be someone good and then almost tricked him into making it, but then stole it, which is almost a perfect callback to the Galley Law Company, where many of the shipwrights actually turned out to be Cypherpole agents all along. It was a long con specifically to try and get those blueprints. Also, Franky wanted the Straw Hats' money during that arc because without it, he couldn't get Atomwood to build the ship of his dreams. So if we combine all of that together, maybe the robot wanted to build the Anti-Pluton, maybe just as a safeguard for the real one, but couldn't get it because he didn't have enough money. So then come in the 20 Kings, potentially pretending to be his friend, because maybe he doesn't even know who they really are at this point. So the Kings then pull their money together, which they have from their home countries, and then once the weapon's finally built, they just take it and use it for something other than what the robot wanted, which is basically a successful version of Water 7 and Enies Lobby, basically. And to make that theme even stronger, this all happened during the flood flood known as Aqua Laguna, and right now we obviously have this flood starting in the final saga. Also, Frankie's ultimate creation may even parallel the robots, because Frankie's is the Thousand Sunny, and the robot's weapon put a literal sun over Enies Lobby, both kind of creating a sun but in very different ways. And what this may have also done is painted the Ancient Kingdom out to be the bad guys, or at least Joy Boy's crew specifically, because if the 20 Kings were able to frame the robot or Joy Boy's crew as the reason for this flood, or whatever happened to Enies Lobby or whatever, that might explain all the apologies and simply how Joy Boy lost, because Luffy being able to have everyone on his side is one of his strongest traits. Without that, he's probably never gonna even become the Pirate King. The government's first move in the Void Century may have been making sure that Joy Boy didn't have that same advantage. Only his crew would have really known the truth about this, a little bit like we have right now with Luffy, who's kind of always depicted as some sort of demon even when he's really a good guy. And on top of that, maybe this robot's even part of the clan that originally built the Noah all those years ago. It would kind of make sense if all the important ships or technology or whatever came from the same group, which is something we'll touch on later when we get to the Space Pirates Jolly Roger. But going back to the apology real quick, I think this is a great callback to when Tom told Frankie he has to love all of his creations. If the robot is truly apologizing because he made the Anti-Pluton, I bet you Frankie is going to tell him to stop, because the lesson he learned was that creating things isn't the issue. It's bad people who use them for bad reasons. And this would be a perfect example of why Frankie is the right person to sort of carry both the robot and Vegapunk's torch into the new era. He understands both sides of this issue. He knows you have to love what you make, but at the same time, he knows there's a lot of risk involved, thus why he decided to destroy those blueprints. There's a fine line to walk, and Frankie walks it. He met Robin and learned that it was riskier to keep the blueprints around since Robin was a good person. If she did find Pluton, it wouldn't be used for evil purposes, which is really crazy looking back on it, because Robin knew Pluton was in Wano when Enies Lobby was going on. She didn't make a peep about it until she got to Wano either, which is why I'm like 100% certain that she knows about Uranus too. I mean, she is the one person who said its name so far in the manga. Now in the anime it was Neptune who said it, which was always kind of weird to me. But what I think is ironic about all of this is just that even though Robin is definitely a good person, Blackbeard may be the one who's on his way to Wano to get Pluton after he speaks to Caribou. So some kind of anti-Pluton may actually be necessary at some point in the future to counter him. Maybe Frankie memorized the blueprints before he burned them and actually does build the real one in the future, which would be yet another great parallel to the ancient robot who may have built one and destroyed Enies Lobby. But I think what's more likely to happen here is just that the Straw Hats wrestle Pluton away somehow, because getting all three of the ancient weapons to follow Luffy at least by the end of the story just seems sort of a given, I think. But if the Anti-Pluton was used at Enies Lobby back then, maybe we should ask where that weapon is today. Could it be possible that that weapon is what the government used on Lelucia, but with the Mother Flame as its power source instead of the Ancient Kingdom's superior one, thus explaining why only Enies Lobby has a sun? Maybe that thing up there is the Anti-Pluton, or even Uranus as many people have theorized, and it just needs kinda charged up before it can start blasting. Sort of like Enel used his fruit to power the Arc Maxim to make thunderclouds and help him make the Raigo. And while the government having a weapon like that is a definite possibility, I think it's more likely that the Mother Flame itself just is the weapon because it's used like an atomic bomb, or a weather egg, or something like that. The Anti-Pluton probably is a multi-use thing as long as you have a good enough power source, but I bet they lost it back in the day, and that's why they were pursuing those blueprints. They needed another one, and since they couldn't get them, they're using the best thing that Vegapunk could come up with, which is the Mother Flame. But the reason I say the Mother Flame may be more like a bomb is because we have already been told that York is able to replicate the Mother Flame, and that she even sent them the first one. How is that possible if the Mother Flame is at Egghead unless she already replicated one? There had to be a second Mother Flame. Topman Workery also mentioned that they want to create the Mother Flame again. And since Emu pretty clearly said the weapon at Lelucia was the Mother Flame, I think it's more likely that they basically duplicate it and blow it up so they use an entire one each time. But since we recently saw that the Mother Flame does actually have a flame in it, one that can apparently stay alive underwater, I think it could be an Olympic torch type situation. This is probably why York said as long as she has the power station at Egghead, she can make more of them. She almost needs to like transfer the fire to another machine machine so she can just blow up that separate machine, which, if true, is a great tie to Vegapunk being modeled after Einstein, as well as other geniuses, because Einstein's role in the Manhattan Project at least played some kind of part in the creation of the atomic bombs. But Einstein was a pacifist. He would have rather used that technology to help the world instead of wreaking havoc, even though he did acknowledge that bad people getting a hold of it is just as dangerous. So York and Vegapunk are probably representative of what a good and bad person would do with the same exact technology. So now whenever it comes to whatever was above the clouds at Lelucia, I think it was just another mother flame but inside a weather egg, or just some kind of bomb or something, with a remote detonator inside that they then blew up so all the energy was released at once. I mean, there's a lot of thematic similarities to when Nami dropped some of her biggest attacks with Zeus, and weather eggs are almost like Oda's fun version of bombs as it is. And I mean, just compare that to Egghead Island. It's a giant cracked egg floating on a cloud with the mother flame inside of it. York already has the template, or the blueprints you could say, to make all of that since she is a Vegapunk and lived there. She probably helped build all of that stuff originally. York probably just replicated that entire thing, but with the purpose of bringing basically a giant lightning strike or whatever on Lelucia. And this is why the government wants York to create more mother flames. They need one for each blast probably. And I think there's actually a good tie-in here to how Vegapunk's labs have self-destructed in the past, as we saw in Baltimore as well as Punk Hazard. I think most people took these events as somewhat of a gag or just a trope, especially with like the big self-destruct buttons just laying around. But let's think about this just a little bit more now that we know about the mother flame. Because what exactly blew up in those labs that caused such a big explosion? It was probably each island's power source. What caused those labs to explode back then is probably very similar to what York did to Lelucia, except I would imagine the mother flame is better than anything Vegapunk had at his past two labs, thus why the destruction was so insane. And then we would have to ask, well, why would Vegapunk put self-destruct buttons around there? Well, probably for moments like this, whereas technology is on the verge of being used by the wrong people to create terrible outcomes, meaning that I kinda wonder if Egghead is also going to explode from a self-destruct button at some point. But since the Ancient Kingdom's technology is always just a little bit better than Vegapunk's, I bet the Anti-Pluton and Pluton itself are both weapons you could just keep shooting over and over, because that's like an upgrade from a one-use thing, right? We even saw this idea play out in Wano a little bit, where Sanji noticed that Queen could shoot a barrage of lasers and that Frankie probably wants that technology, since usually he just shoots one giant radical beam at a time. The Mother Flame is probably the same way compared to the Ancient Kingdom's weapons, and I would have to assume that the government probably lost the Anti-Pluton back in the day somehow. Obviously, we recently learned that Pluton has been locked under Wano this entire time, but where has the Anti-Pluton been since it made the hole at Enies Lobby? Did it maybe get destroyed, or has it been out there somewhere waiting? Well, this is going to sound really crazy at first, but what if that weapon is Zunesha? Now you might be wondering, how could an elephant create the hole at Enies Lobby, but what if it's not just an elephant? What if Zunesha is the Anti-Pluton, but was given a mythical elephant fruit of the model Natame Narita, which Oda already told us is the species Zunesha belongs to, which would be a crazy parallel to Funkfried, who was a sword that had a regular elephant zone fruit, who we actually met during the Enies Lobby arc. And the guy who owned Funkfried is the same guy who was chasing those blueprints all along. This could all tie to Zunesha's great crime 800 years ago. Creating the hole at Enies Lobby and maybe sinking the Ancient Kingdom's capital would probably qualify. That would definitely be an action worth punishing in my estimation. But I doubt Zunesha would have done that willingly. They were a companion to Joy Boy, so there was probably some coercion or trickery involved. I could kind of see Zunesha almost being like the Chopper of the crew, since they're both animals already, sort of, and Chopper is super gullible, so that parallel might fit too with Zunesha. And now some of you still might be wondering here, if Zunesha has a devil fruit, wouldn't it just be too weak to walk in the sea since its super long legs are submerged? Well, no, because you can walk in water with a devil fruit and still be okay. I mean, look at San Juan Wolf. This dude is like 75% submerged in the ocean and has a devil fruit, but can still walk around. ground. Zunesha's whole body is up out of the water, so Oda might even be using this to hide the fact Zunesha actually has a fruit, because we probably don't think about it that way. Plus, I know Oda spoke about the Natame Narita elephant as if it was a legit species, but I think it would be so much easier to just chalk this thing up to being a mythical creature from a devil fruit than actually being the result of a legitimate animal, because the proportions here are just crazy. I'm not sure if the planet even has enough room to sustain a viable population of these giant things, especially if the sea levels were once a lot lower than they are now, because that's a lot more strain on those super long legs at that point. And if Zunesha is truly the Anti-Pluton, it would make so much sense that Zunesha is now the being who will free Pluton again, because we know Momo is meant to command it to break the walls down. Where this weapon was once meant to destroy Pluton, maybe it will now aid in its resurgence as a way to make up for its crimes, completely inverting the original purpose of that weapon's creation. I mean, when it comes to freeing Pluton, I think everyone's first thought is just that Zunesha is going to swing its trunk to break down the walls. But what if that's not it? What if Zunesha uses a freaking laser or something? And this actually makes some sense to me, because if it was just a matter of swinging the trunk to break the walls, you'd have to imagine that Luffy's Bajrang gun or Blackbeard's Gura Gura powers could knock those things down as well. So requiring some sort of special ability that only Zunesha has thanks to its origins would make a lot more sense here, I think. And maybe the craziest part about all of this is if you go back to the anime version of Frankie's time skip, where he's on Karakuri Island inside Vegapunk's old lab, he finds blueprints with a rocket, a devil fruit, which kind of resembles Luffy's fruit, and then when they combine, you get a monkey with rockets on his back. Since this was in the anime only, I never put a ton of stock into it, but after doing this theory, especially this bit about Zunesha, it all kind of hit me. These blueprints are probably a dumbed down version of what Frankie saw on his blueprints in Enies Lobby, except instead of a generic rocket, Frankie probably saw the ancient power source, the one the robot uses that can probably create a sun. And then the devil fruit is probably just a stand-in for basically any zone fruit, since we know they can be given to inanimate objects and make them sentient. And then the last one is what you get when you combine them. In this example, we see a gorilla with rockets, but for Zunesha, it would be an elephant with an incredibly strong power source at its disposal. And then that takes me over to Pluton. What if the blueprints for Pluton are almost the same exact thing as this, but it's just a different devil fruit, meaning those blueprints back then were kind of for both Pluton and the counter at the same time. And that might be why the blueprints say Pluton on them, but Frankie told us it wasn't actually for Pluton, but was for the counter. The only difference between the two would be the animal that the power source becomes. Unless you have two of the same fruit, you can't really create two of the same weapon then. So that means that probably both Pluton and any other anti-Plutons use the same exact power source. And on top of that, as we saw with Zunesha, only Momo was able to command it. So what if doing it in this way allows the weapons to have a chain of command, since they're all kind of part cyborg at that point, right? They all have part machine in them, even if they're also alive on top of that. So it might be like Zunesha has some type of authority chip, and maybe the same goes for Pluton. But to wrap this back into the 20 Kings in the Void Century, I think their use of this weapon at Enies Lobby is likely what started the 100-year void and all the chaos that ensued. But with that being said, I don't think this is their only tool to start a flood, because on one hand, each shot of this weapon only increases the sea level by 1 meter, which is a decent amount, surely, and the resulting tsunamis were felt by pretty much everyone. But if you're trying to submerge every island around the world, they would have a long way to go. And in chapter 1114, we even saw Magellan and Doflamingo discussing this very topic, and they said most urban areas would be screwed at just a 5-meter rise, so they probably need at least that many mother flames. But if they want to get everyone, you'd have to spam this weapon over and over and over again. The Earth would almost look like Swiss cheese at that point. But if we compare that over to the Void Century, there seems to be only one hole that we really know of from the past, which is at Enies Lobby. It doesn't seem like the government spammed that weapon over and over again to make the flood happen back in the day. If they did, we'd have likely seen other gaps in the ocean by now. So I want to run through some options that I've heard that might explain how this could all work. And option one that I want to present is the pole shift theory. I first heard about this from a video by Japanese YouTuber Drop the Pizza, which I'll leave a link for down below. But the main idea for this theory is that the axis of the One Piece planet may have shifted once upon a time. Where the North and South Pole once were may no longer be where they are today. And if this actually happened, then maybe this is what Oda was really trying to tell us when he had Roger ask Rayleigh if he wanted to turn the world upside down. And the best evidence for this has to be these panels from Skypiea, where the cardinal directions between the maps of Jaya, which is more recent, and Skypiea, which is ancient, don't align. They're off by 90 degrees. If you take this at just face value, it's pretty conclusive evidence that the poles did shift once upon a time. Now, the one caveat to make here is that it could just be that the island that went into the air spun 90 degrees before it landed up in the sky. If that did happen, that would explain why the cardinal directions are off in one place but not the other. But even if that was true, I think there's a ton of symbolism here at a minimum, which could mean that this still happened, because magnetism has always been a very crucial part to the One Piece world, thanks at least in part to the log poses. Magnetism is the main form of navigation in One Piece, and I know we love to meme on Eustace Kid a lot, but his fruit should be extremely important in this regard. Oda clearly had a plan for this guy and probably still does, and I wouldn't be surprised if his fruit gets involved, because whenever he awakens, he can even assign magnetism to different people, like we saw with Big Mom, where he can put N and S on different things and make them attract. But if the planet were to shift its tilt 90 degrees very suddenly somehow, then we should talk about what would happen to the planet, which is basically making the entire thing uninhabitable, let alone the changes to day and night and the climate. Suddenly rotating the Earth such that the axis was tilted 90 degrees is also going to mess with the tides and bring massive tsunamis and insane levels of flooding, which is something Oda kind of mentioned already during an SBS, and I talked about this quite a lot in my last Void Century video, where if our planet stopped swirling just as it is now, there would be catastrophic natural disasters everywhere, tidal waves everywhere. According to Oda, this is the importance of swirls, and why we even see them on the devil fruits and on Sanji's eyebrows. The swirling of the planet and the universe is essential for our own equilibrium. If it were to stop or be messed with in any way, you're going to be seeing flooding pretty much everywhere, but maybe not permanent flooding, because the pole shift is just going to make things kind of crazy for some amount of time, but eventually it will reach another state of equilibrium where the water kind of evens out, or at least it should. But there is kind of a twist there, because if you shift the poles and just leave it there, then the North and South Pole, which are really cold, would then probably be along the equator, which is the hottest point around the planet. Therefore, those polar ice caps would start melting, which would increase the sea level pretty drastically, which is pretty much what's going on in our world with global warming or climate change, because ice contracts when it freezes, meaning that when it melts, the total volume of the ocean will expand, and thus Florida has to go pack their bags. And this would give a whole new context to Shanks and Buggy's debate about whether the North or South Pole is colder, which we saw them having while on Roger's ship. If the North and South Pole are that cold and it gets put along the equator, that's probably a lot of water to add to the One Piece oceans. To me, this is probably the most likely scenario for the true flooding. The Mother Flame may be a precursor and may be useful in other ways, but if you're trying to submerge the entire planet at once, pole shifting and melting the ice caps is a better answer. And before the pole shift, or after the next one I guess, this could maybe make Reverse Mountain and Marie Joie the new North and South Pole, which is maybe just how things are supposed to be. And I gotta say, this would be incredibly ironic to me, because in the 4Kids dub, Laboon was actually just a giant iceberg and they skipped over him, which is absolutely unacceptable. But if it turns out that Reverse Mountain becomes like the North Pole and gets really cold and actually has icebergs at some point, that would be some insane foreshadowing, especially if Oda had any hand in that decision, which I don't know if he did. But I think Marie Joie being cold also sort of makes sense because of Emu's freezer, which holds the giant straw hat. Perhaps there's some kind of advantage to having Marie Joie be frozen that we just don't know about yet. But speaking of all these icebergs, I think we should talk about Iceberg the character, because he said he was going to make Water 7 into a ship since the island was sinking into the sea after the repeated Aqua Lagunas. And that's perfect timing, since every island might be faced with a similar issue. He might have every island calling him up for his services pretty soon, just like Rayleigh is. But the question is, how is Iceberg going to achieve this? Well, this is actually one of my favorite theories ever, because simply put, I think Iceberg is going to make the island float on an iceberg. This is due to the fact that ice floats in water, and using an iceberg would obviously make for the ultimate pun as well. It's honestly hard hard for me to imagine any other way to make an island float without maybe using a devil fruit power or some kind of Vegapunk level technology. And a good example of what Water 7 may be like is Thriller Bark, which is a giant landmass from another sea that Moria used as a ship. And we know that beneath that island was a giant freezer which kept ores inside. And we even saw later in the arc that Frankie used the cold from that freezer as a weapon. I think it's entirely possible that Thriller Bark is also floating on an iceberg, and that's where all the cold comes from. So perhaps this provides us with an opportunity to save some of the other islands by using ice. And that takes us over to Marshall D. Teach, because he now has Kuzan on his crew who has the ice fruit. What if Teach goes around offering the opportunity to save each island as long as they bend the knee to him, where then Kuzan can then make a quick iceberg and lift the island up? This could be the very beginning of Teach's attempt to actually take over the world. He might even go and save the richest and most militarily advanced countries first because of the firepower it would give him, which I think could be its own parallel to the world government, where 20 kings of different countries work together to beat the ancient kingdom. So maybe Teach goes around and gets like 19 other nations to join his alliance, and boom, we almost have a recreation of that whole thing. I could even see him bring all these different countries to Marijois so we have a similar scene to Whitebeard and all his allies, except instead of pirate ships, it's literally entire islands on icebergs coming all the way up to the red line since it's flooded. And I think this all goes back to what I said earlier about the importance of resources. By having a common existential enemy that all these countries need saved from, Blackbeard can exchange protection for the country's army or money or whatever they have that's useful, which is basically what the government already does with pirates. They have this vicious cycle where they vilify pirates and create bounties for them, even when they aren't that bad or dangerous, which then makes civilians scared of pirates and feel like they need some kind of protection from them. And that is why they pay the government the celestial tribute. As long as they're paying that, the Marines will come and protect them. So then the government can use that money to increase their military might even further, either with bigger forces or better technology like from Vegapunk, which then exacerbates the issue even more. This whole story is a game to control the resources, whether that's money, weapons, the earth itself, or even people. This is why Dragon and the Revolutionary Army have basically been focused on taking out supply chains. They want to stop the government from having these important resources. They were trying to stop them from getting the liquor iron ore. They literally destroyed the food storages up in Marijois, and they've just been freeing all sorts of government-allied countries from around the world. The government's grip on the world is far weaker than it once was, and that's not just because of Vegapunk's reveal. And I think it's really interesting to think about how this global flood can act as kind of a way to not just reset the world from a population or resource standpoint, but also within some of the allegiances. Because if your island is sinking and someone comes along to lend a hand, you're probably going to take that help regardless of who it's from and what they ask of you. And you know, getting saved from certain death or terrible situations in general is a tried and true way of getting people to join your side, which gaining allies is one of Luffy's greatest strengths already, as it is Buggy's, and Mihawk called that the most dangerous ability in this entire ocean. And now the flood may offer a chance for the whole world to be up for grabs to those who can save it. So I think that in the final saga, we're gonna have this thing where every country that gets saved sort of joins the fleet of that pirate, because almost everyone in the world will be a pirate at that point. You're either getting on a boat to survive or riding on an iceberg thing. You're sailing one way or the other. So it would be fitting for them all to sort of loosely join the crew that saved them and fight with them in the final war. And this might give increased importance to the title of Pirate King, because all that name really means right now is that you found the One Piece. I mean, that's amazing and all, but it's not like other pirates are going to listen to you the next day as if you're some kind of royalty. But imagine if almost everyone in the world was a pirate, and ones that aren't used to being a pirate at that, because they were just chilling on their country a few days ago. The title of Pirate King might carry a lot more weight at that point, at least in a thematic way. But with all that being said, I do have one more option for the flooding that I found really interesting. If you look at the One Piece world, it's basically split up into two halves, or two separate basins of water basically, because of the red line. However, they aren't 100% separate. There's a hole where Fishman Island is, which then allows the ocean to sort of level out evenly, and then Reverse Mountain is actually taking some water from the New World side into the Paradise side. So if you were to go block off that hole at Fishman Island, then then the Paradise side should start filling up from the New World side. Water would only be going from one half to the other, but not the reverse. So you could almost create flooding at least on half of the world by blocking up that hole at Fishman Island, which would then essentially make the red line into a giant dam, which it basically already is now, but again, with that one hole in it, it doesn't really act that way. And if you wanted to fill in that gap in the red line, you would have to move or just straight up destroy Fishman Island. And this is where Shiarli's prophecy comes in. She already saw a future where Luffy comes to destroy and wreak havoc, which on paper seems horrific, but there may be a legitimate reason for it. Joy Boy already left a huge apology for Poseidon, which I theorize was because Fishman Island had to stay down there for 800 years. So it would kind of make sense to me that Luffy is later responsible for the abrupt end to that 800-year stay, because he may need to destroy that island in order to protect at least half of the world. Now, what he does with the other half that starts filling up, I'm not really sure, because the half that would be filling up in this scenario would be the Paradise side. However, the two holes in the ocean that we know of, being at Enies Lobby and the Lucia, are both on that side of the world, on the Paradise side. So maybe those two holes can almost act as drains of some kind to limit the sea level on that side. Because despite everything I've said so far, the one thing that hasn't really been explained is how these holes work. Like, how doesn't the water just fill back in? In order for the sea level to have risen from these, it means this hole is taking up more volume in the ocean than before. But shouldn't the water just like fill back in and actually decrease the volume since the land got vaporized? I mean, we can see at Enies Lobby that there's basically a waterfall over on the edge. So I think there's basically two options here. One is just some weird anti-gravity stuff, some kind of magic almost. We know that Vegapunk has been working with anti-gravity tech, so maybe it's just like pushing the ocean downward or something continually. But if I had to guess, I don't think this is going to be the answer, because Enies Lobby kind of extends over the hole in question. And while we were there during that arc, there weren't any weird effects or anything. It seems like quite literally the water's just falling over the edge like a normal waterfall. So then the other option is that under the water may be basically the same kind of structure that Wano has, but it's reversed, where there's almost like a giant stone tube going downward, and the waterfall we see is just the water going over the lip of it down to the bottom. Where in Wano, it was the opposite. The fresh water was flowing out of the tube instead of in it. And also the tube was filled up with water instead of being empty as it is at Enies Lobby. And so I guess the logic here would be like the laser melted a lot of the land on its way down, and the resulting lava kind of cooled around the laser and created this giant tube. But if this was true, then where is that water going? Because in order for the sea level to not be lowering, the water that's going down has to be recirculating back into the ocean at a continual rate somewhere else. If it was filling the bottom of it, it would probably have filled up completely by now. And also that would make the sea level back to what it used to be, or even lower since the land isn't there. So it has to be getting back into the ocean somewhere. And my best guess is that it's going to the knock-up streams, because Cricket's theory was that water was getting caught in a cave beneath the sea, close to the volcanic vents and such, where it then turned to steam and eventually explodes into a knock-up stream. These holes in the ocean from Enies Lobby and the Lucia probably stretch down to at least the volcanic vents, if not almost the core of the earth, where the falling water probably does turn to steam then, and then one way or another, I bet the steam is getting caught in different pockets in the tectonic plates or whatever, and then they just explode periodically in different parts of the world. Maybe Enies Lobby's hole caused the knock-up stream near Jaya, since it's not that far away, and the one at La Lucia maybe caused the warm eddy that we saw near Egghead, and maybe that'll have more knock-up streams in the future. And then, like I touched on earlier, if Enies Lobby was this important to get deleted, to the point where the 20 Kings used a weapon of mass destruction on it, then it's probably something really important, like the Ancient Kingdom's capital or whatever. But I think we should go ahead and look at the other places nearby that the government also controls, because those may have also been other important Ancient Kingdom areas, such as Impel Down and Marineford. These are the three government strongholds that surround the Gates of Justice. Would it not make sense that if Enies Lobby once held an important place for the Ancient Kingdom, then these other places may do the same thing? For example, I heard this great theory recently from Reddit user Matthew Sco, where the Romanized name for Impel Down is actually spelled quite a bit differently, and is pronounced loosely Imperu Down, which could then loosely be called Empire Dawn, or maybe Dawn Empire, meaning Impel Down was once maybe a castle or main headquarters for the Ancient Kingdom. Like I said at the beginning, you probably look at this thing a lot differently, keeping in mind that there was a flood, because for now it's an underwater prison, but if there wasn't so much water, it would just look like a normal castle. And maybe the government just retrofitted this castle to be their own prison, almost as a slap in the face to the ancient kingdom, because most of the people they're putting in that prison are probably people who live like those in the ancient kingdom, where they live freely, like pirates, and against what the world government believes in. And then the last place in this trio is Marineford. Now this one I'm honestly not so sure about, especially because they moved to New Marineford on the other side of the red line, so drop a comment below if you have any ideas what the ancient kingdom may have been doing here. But generally speaking, this kind of gives us a general sense of where the main base of the ancient kingdom was operating, meaning that Laughtail may also be somewhere around here. And if you have followed the channel at all, then you know I think this is located right under Long Ring Longland. Because remember the ancient kingdom symbol I talked about earlier? Does it not look a lot like Long Ring Longland? Now this island has 10 points instead of the 8, but still, the dots around the circle thing is there. And so that makes me wonder what is in the center of this thing. And that's where Aqua Laguna comes into play, the annual flood that hits Water 7 every single year. But what's interesting is that water comes from the Long Ring Longland area. So instead of that island flooding, it actually has receding tides for a day, revealing itself to actually be a crown shape, which is perfect if this place is really where people can become the Pirate King. Now, if you want to hear a lot more about this Long Ring Longland stuff and what I think the One Piece actually is, I will leave a link to these videos down below. But the fact that this island has receding tides during a flood is probably a hint to the ancient kingdom at large. Like maybe it too is submerged deep beneath the sea, as is most of Long Ring Longland, and it's just waiting for us to find some way of receding the tides and revealing it. Basically, the ancient kingdom is probably Atlantis. And this sort of Enies Lobby, Impel Down, Marineford, Long Ring Longland, Water 7 area of the world, which all these things are pretty close to one another, was probably just the capital, headquarters, whatever you want to call it, for the ancient kingdom. I mean, even underneath Water 7, which is also very close to this area, there's an ancient city underneath it that we have yet to see. We know this place exists because the current Water 7 was said to be built on top of it after it sunk. So if Iceberg makes the entire island float with an iceberg, we may actually get to see that city resurface, kind of like we might see with Old Wano after its walls get broken down. And maybe plenty of other places if we ever remove or vaporize the red line so the sea level just goes down entirely. But I think there's still one glaring question about the flood that occurred in the past. If really old islands like Alabasta or Dressrosa are still at or above sea level today, and we know they existed before the Void Century, did the water level from the flood back then recede after a while back to normal, or did the islands get lifted up or something? Or were they originally way above sea level so now it's just even? Well, personally, I think it's that they got pulled up to the proper level. And maybe that's what Joy Boy did, because whenever you awaken the Nika fruit, you can turn things to rubber and stretch them. And I think this is kind of signified by Long Ring Longland, which not only has all these seemingly stretched up points, but their wildlife and plants and everything stretched too because they feel free. Perhaps the islands around the world were once much lower, kind of creating like a Pangea type effect, but they got pulled up. So technically they are still connected, we just don't really know. Which would almost mean that Joy Boy like created piracy by creating all these different islands and stuff, which aligns perfectly with the fact that we just heard Joy Boy was the first ever pirate. Now personally, I think where this is going to lead is that pirates are a government construct, so he's like the first person to take to the seas and be an enemy to the 20 kings, but Oda loves his double entendres, so maybe Joy Boy did stretch up all the islands whenever the world flooded, so he kind of created a world for pirates. However, if that is true, we know that there still had to be an ocean back then. The people on the moon called it the Blue Planet, and that was at least 1100 years ago. So I think the situation was just that the sea level back then was a lot lower than now, but there still was an ocean. And then after the red line was completed and the pole shift and whatever else happened, it rose and Joy Boy probably stretched all the islands up high enough to survive. Or maybe Joy Boy just turned the whole planet to rubber and everyone else could pull their islands up themselves or something. But I want to switch gears a bit and talk more about what Enel found on the moon, as well as why the space pirate's Jolly Roger looks like Vegapunk's head. Because I've seen almost countless theories discussing this cover story page, with some saying these things could represent the ancient weapons, or some saying that this flame up here may tie to the mother flame that we recently saw, which is the main thing that I want to hone in on, because this half sphere up here in the corner is definitely meant to be our sun. No doubt about that, I think. And as I mentioned quite a few times earlier in the video, the ancient kingdom's power source is actually capable of making its own sun, but Vegapunk's can't, even though he's really close. So I think what Oda might be saying here is that our universe's sun is man-made, kind of like the one at Enies Lobby, by the ancient kingdom's technology. It probably has an eternal flame within it, which is the slight upgrade from the Mother Flame. But then what about the space pirates? How did they get up there? Who are they? And what's up with their logo? Well, I think we have to start by talking about Dr. Tsukimi, who built automata just like the ones on the moon while he was on Karakuri Island, which is Vegapunk's homeland. He ended up choking after seeing an explosion on the moon, and then his automata went up there for revenge where the space pirates defeated them. But the fact that the space pirate who beat them is the same one that Enel defeated kinda gives us a timeline of events here, showing us that Dr. Tsukimi died rather recently if we assume the automata went for revenge pretty quickly. Now, is it possible that the space pirate we saw can live a super long time so that he maybe beat the automata forever ago and then Enel went up there today? Maybe, but I'm gonna assume he has a normal lifespan, so these events are pretty close. And that would mean that Dr. Tsukimi was alive while the space pirates were up there. And that's kind of backed up by the fact that we saw another explosion up there while Enel was there. It seems like they're trying to blow stuff up because they're attempting to excavate the ruins that are inside the moon. And I think that puts the explosion he saw on the moon and why he was so surprised in a different context. What if he had something to do with the group that was up there? What if he was their captain? Or maybe he at least built a ship for them to get up there in the first place, meaning that he would be surprised at the explosion because he was worried, not knowing what could have gone wrong or how someone else could have gotten there and done something to them. I mean, he was already able to build automata like the ones on the moon, so it would kind of make sense he had intel from there because he knew the people going there. Or maybe he even went up there himself a long time ago, but then he retired and that's why he's just chilling on Karakuri Island. So then that ties us back over to Vegapunk, who is from the island the automata were built on, and his head shares the same shape as the space pirate's Jolly Roger. So what if Vegapunk basically commissioned this entire thing? What if Vegapunk actually had a pirate operation going on behind the scenes? This might seem kind of surprising at first, but think about Clover. He wasn't just an archaeologist, he was basically a full-on pirate that was out there causing trouble, just like Luffy or anybody else would. But the thing is, we didn't really have a full grasp of this until after his death. But with Vegapunk now basically finishing the job Clover started with this message, it would make sense for this parallel to work too, since Vegapunk is kinda dead right now. Maybe we'll find out later he did have something to do with the moon. In fact, I could see Dr. Tsukimi almost being like Vegapunk's version of Tom almost. Maybe he inspired Vegapunk to go out and learn new things and do whatever he had to do to accomplish his dreams. And here's where things get super spicy, because we know Frankie's parents were pirates and that they abandoned him 26 years ago, but we don't know much else other than that. But given Frankie's intellect and knack for building things, I would imagine his parents were pretty similar. I mean, Oda's done that trope plenty of times, like Usopp and Yasopp both being good snipers, for example. So what if Frankie's parents were space pirates? Now, I'm not saying they were among the ones Enel defeated, because they'd probably be like 70 or 80 by now if they're even alive still, but perhaps they worked for Vegapunk in the past. Again, intertwining these two characters in a deeper way than they even understand currently. And maybe now their son is the one who's destined to surpass their old captain at some point. Maybe Frankie will even take us to the moon eventually. And the reason I really like this for Vegapunk is because, as you've probably caught on throughout this entire video, he's sort of Oda's example of how the Ancient Kingdom came to be. He's like a mini version of the Ancient Kingdom, but in real time. He serves as many different parallels for what may have happened back then. And as I mentioned with the Ancient Kingdom symbol, it seems very likely that they went beyond Earth and had other planets as a part of an alliance or something like that. So for Vegapunk then to be the first person involved with interplanetary space travel since the Void Century, it just makes so much sense given all the other parallels that he's had to the Ancient Kingdom already. And there's one last element to all this flood stuff that I think is really worth discussing. And it's honestly maybe the biggest reason for a flood of all, which is getting rid of devil fruit users. Sure, a flood is a great way to wipe out people in general, but devil fruit users get weakened as soon as they get in the water. So if you put them in a flood, that weakness is turned up to 100. And it's probably not just about killing the devil fruit users, but also recovering their fruits. Perhaps once they drown most of the world, they have a mechanism in place to make sure all the devil fruits reincarnate with them instead of elsewhere. Now, the caveat to this is that we only have a little bit of information on the specifics of how devil fruit reincarnation works, with our best example being Smiley, who, if you don't remember, was that giant poison thing that had an axolotl zone fruit in Punk Hazard, and when it died, its fruit reincarnated into a nearby apple on this wagon thing. And we can probably say that Logia fruits do the same thing because of Ace's fruit, which Sabo got. But that's really all the information we have. We also haven't seen a devil fruit user drown drowned before, so I really wonder if the reincarnation works the same in that scenario. So our best overall assumption right now is just that when a user dies, the closest regular fruit becomes that devil fruit. But what if every fruit is underwater because of the flood? Do they still respawn there? I mean, if the ocean is a devil fruit user's biggest weakness, then I'm not so sure that the fruits would be able to respawn in the ocean either. So go